So here we are, I'm out at a Heritage Park. I'm in my civilian clothing, so I'm not recognised, but I have morphed into another Chris here beside me. We're at the visitor centre up at Ferns Castle. Dr. Dennis Shine will be talking in a moment. Chris,
thank you very much for coming. You're all very welcome. It's lovely to see the visitor centre so packed. I'm in my OPW guide uniform, and our visitor centre here is about 15 years old, designed by one of the youngest architects in the OPW, and it was a lady. And she did this beautiful building in a curved shape to mirror the curve on the castle. It's bright, airy, modern, and houses the Ferns tapestry. And the guides work from the desk here, and it really blends in with the old castle, the old and the new together. It's lovely to have it so busy.
And tell us, the 850 celebrations, obviously having Dr. Dennis Shine here today is great.
Having Dennis here is fantastic.
For the year itself and the programme, it's a massive year for us.
It's a massive year for us, and the interest is huge. And Dennis has been here with some other of his students studying the castle as well, and has given us great insight into, you know, things that we wouldn't have known about. It's lovely to learn all this new laser technology and what we're going to find out about how it was built and why the rooms were where they were. So it's wonderful.
And it's, I mean, you know the story very well, but isn't it amazing when you're brought back to the story again and you read it again? There's so many layers. There's so much intrigue.
There is
going on.
You always learn something, and every day is a school day. I'm here 12 years now, even with the Ferns tapestry, which was done by 25 local ladies, and tells the history of Ferns in stitching from the Celtic times right through the Viking invasion, the Norman invasion, St. Aidan, who founded our town. Give them a little dust over every morning, and every day I see something different. Every day I find a flower I didn't know was there. We have a little competition with the kids. Can you find the cat? It's the same with the castle. Dennis is going to give a talk tonight. I'm sure I'll hear things I never knew before, so it's wonderful. It is wonderful.
You're very good. Thanks
Not
for
at
giving
all,
us your
and thank
time.
you again for coming.
Great.
Okay, Castle. My name is Christine. I'm the head guide here, and Larry, who likes to think he's the head guide, is here also, Larry Smith. And it is absolutely wonderful to see our visitor centre so full of an evening. We are having a very busy season. We're delighted. We have all school children visiting this month, and we'll have hopefully lots of visitors now in July, August and September. And the visitor centre here was built 15 years ago, so it's a little bit younger than our 800-year-old castle, and it houses the Ferns tapestry, which is the hand-stitched history of the village done by 25 local ladies, all voluntary, and it took them 5 years. It goes through Celtic times, St. Aidan founding the town, Viking history, Norman history, and of course our Dermot MacMurrough story. Tonight I am delighted to welcome Dennis here to hear a little bit more about what went on in 850 years ago. As I said to some of the guys earlier, every day we learn something different. Things that we thought we knew change daily. We think we know information about the wonderful stones that we have here, headstones, gravestones, own stones, and we find out that we're not what we thought they were. So every day something evolves. We will never be corrected as tour guides here. We like to learn as we go. We like to tell everybody we're not historians, we're tour guides, and every day we learn. So it's wonderful to have you all here, and I hope you have a wonderful evening. So I'll hand you over to Dennis now. Thank you.
Good evening, everybody. We're delighted to be here this evening, myself and lots of other people from the Carrick project. If you can't hear me, the acoustics are pretty good in this room, but if I'm going too fast or if anybody can't hear me, just let me know, stick your hand up and I'll talk a bit louder or a bit slower. It's a big year for Wexford, I guess. I'm sure we have plenty of Wexford people here, and it's a big year for us in terms of celebrations because it's the 850th anniversary of the arrival of the Anglo-Normans. And when most people, certainly historians or archaeologists, when they think of Wexford, they think of how it is synonymous with the Anglo-Norman presence. So anybody who's from the county, you know it very well, but for those who aren't, all you have to do is drive around Wexford and you'll see it in the ecclesiastical remains, you'll see it in the castles, you'll even see it in how the fields are divided out and how our landscape has been shaped by them, and in the legacy of the names. There's so many Staffords and Cods and Devereux and Prendergast. It is a county that is Anglo-Norman. It's where the Anglo-Norman invasion started. So this year is the 850th anniversary of their first fleet landing in Bannow, but it's also the 850th anniversary of their first castle, which is the Castle of Carrick, and that's obviously where our title comes from. And the reason we refer to it as enigmatic is it's such an important site to the history of our nation because it's where they made their first mark, their first permanent presence. but not many people in Wexford, and certainly not many people in Ireland even know where it is. Now, I stand to be corrected, I'm probably in a room full of people who know where it is now, but certainly as we go around, not many people are aware of the Carrick site. So we wanted to take this opportunity to sort of celebrate the Carrick site and bring it to the public, because I said it's 850 years old in the autumn. When I say we set up a project, we're the Irish Archaeology Field School, and we set up a project with the Irish National Heritage Park about 18 months ago to try and understand this site, okay? So you may not think you know where it is, but most people know the vista very well. So as you're driving south, going across the Ferry Carrick Bridge, this is taken roughly from Roche's Castle, the nice tower house. I'm sure everybody knows that vista or that view of the round tower. That round tower is a fake, all right? It's a very good fake, but it's only 150 odd years old. And round towers are meant to be 1,000 years old, so it's the best replica the park have, in my opinion, or one of the best ones, all right? But it's actually built through an 850-year-old castle, all right? Which is something that not everybody does know. And in terms of the landscape of where it is, that sort of gives you a better impression. So that's our Carrick site. That's Roche's Castle. The Ferry Carrick Hotel will be here, okay? And then as you go around this bend, you're into Wexford town, okay? So it's a prime location to build a castle because it's at a very good pinch point in the River Slaney between the outer and inner estuary. So a prime location to control space, to control shipping going northward up towards Enniscorthy, and a perfect location in which to choose to build a castle, okay? But there's much more to the site than just a castle. So our main business is to bring international students over and teach them heritage-related programs, be that excavation, be it history, be it archaeology. And our marketing tagline is always come and dig the first Anglo-Norman castle in Ireland, because it sells very well, okay? But there's many other things about the site that are worth celebrating. So it's one of the first half dozen or so 13th century stone castles in Wexford, okay? We'll talk about that later. There was a stone castle on the site by 1231, built by the same people as the castle to your left, all right? It's also got one of the first deer parks, Anglo-Norman deer parks, and we'll talk about that. It's got a 14th century medieval parish church. It's obviously got Roche's Castle right beside it, which is an awful lot later. So there's all these different elements in the landscape, and it's one of the first Anglo-Norman towns as well, okay? So all these things in one place, but not many people are aware of any of them. And certainly if they are, they're not aware of all of them. But we'll begin with the first castle, which is what we call a ringwork. And I'll come back to what ringworks are in a few minutes for those who don't know. They're basically a variant on the moat and bailey. So lots of people have heard of moat and bailey castles. Not everybody's heard of ringworks. But I'll come back to what they are in a few moments, all right? People may be familiar with this image. Does anyone know where it is? Anyone has a guess? No? It's Bannow Bay, all right? So we're going back. We've got a mixed audience, so we're going to have to put in a wee bit of a small bit of history on this as well, especially if you're in the internationals. So the Normans obviously arrived in Bannow Bay in May 1st or 2nd, depending on who you're talking to, 1169, okay? And this is from the Ross Tapestry, which is only rivaled by the Ferns Tapestry in terms of intricacy, all right? But this is the Ross one, and it shows Dermot MacMurrough arriving with the first knight called Robert Fitzstephen. But we'll go back a little bit from that. I'm not going to say too much against Dermot MacMurrough and these surroundings. I might, if I'm speaking somewhere else, I may, all right? He was born in 1132, and I guess a nice way of putting it was, he was a young man when he came to the crown, and the hope was that he might be politically manipulated, okay? Because he was he was a boy when he ascended into the crown of Leinster. And it proved the opposite case. So he's quite an antagonistic character, would probably be a nice way of putting it. And he fell out with quite a few other Irish kings. And this included the famous story that we all know from primary school history, with the abduction of a lady called Derba Gilla, who, when you read the records, it was no more an abduction. She left quite willingly. It was just a love affair, in my opinion, anyway. So, but her husband was understandably not best pleased, and he wasn't paid honour money in return. So it was quite all right by the standards of the time under Breton law for a wife to leave her husband as long as the gentleman who she was eloping to paid money in return. But Dermot MacMurrough refused, okay, because he was a more powerful king than this gentleman who was called Tiernan O'Rourke. And he's from a kingdom called Breffni, which is in the northwest of Ireland, for the northwest-ish, for the international visitors. So he refused to pay the honour money, and O'Rourke sort of waited in the long grass for nearly 15 years. Until MacMurrough also fell out with the High King of Ireland, Rory O'Connor. And at that point he saw his opportunity, and he came down with O'Connor, and even though O'Connor was happy to accept Dermot's sort of fealty as of O'Connor as overlord, O'Rourke burned his house and basically routed him at Ferns. And MacMurrough was forced abroad to try and raise a mercenary army, okay, to reassert his influence in the Echanshilig territory of the southeast, which roughly equates to modern Wexford in terms of area. It wasn't that unusual for these interactions between the two islands, for people to go backwards or forwards. What was very unusual and what MacMurrough did was that he offered land instead of money, because money was something he didn't have, okay? So he went over to Bristol, then on over to France. He met Henry II, and Henry II is quite vague in historical records, but he gave him permission of a sort to raise a mercenary army and come back. And that's exactly what Dermot MacMurrough did. And there's two individuals that are probably worth mentioning that agreed to come back to him. The first everybody knows is Strongbow, or Richard de Clare, okay? He agreed to come back on condition that he was offered Dermot's daughter in marriage, or Aoife. So I'm going into a bit of detail here, I know, but not all the internationals know the story. We have a good few Americans here. He also met another knight called Robert Fitzstephen. And Fitzstephen's a very interesting individual because his nephew wrote a biography of the coming of the Anglo-Normans 20 years after it happened. So in approximately 1189, he wrote this book. And his nephew describes him as a very brave man, a very astute political leader, but a bit too fond of wine and women, okay? So by all accounts, he was meant to be a gregarious, likeable sort of a character. But he also describes him as a knight sprung from two races, because his mother was a Welsh princess, but his father was certainly much more English and was the constable of Cardigan Castle. And Fitzstephen had got himself in a spot of bother, because he'd taken Henry II's side in a conflict between England and Wales. And a few years later, his cousin led a revolt against the English crown, and Fitzstephen ended up in prison. Okay, so his own cousin, Welsh Prince Rhys, put him in prison. And this is where MacMurrough found him. Okay, so he's imprisoned in 1165. So if you can picture, you're sitting in your Welsh prison, and an Irish supposed king comes over and says, look, if you want to come over to Ireland, I can sort out a new lordship for you. All you have to do is get a few knights together, and you can have your fortunes anew in a different isle. And that's exactly what Robert Fitzstephen agreed to do, okay? And his brother agreed to release him, or sorry, his cousin, I should say, on condition he came to Ireland, and that's what he did. So he lands in Bannow Bay in 1169, incidentally not as the first Norman to do so. Robert Fitzgodebert, if anyone's heard of him, had come a couple of years previous to that, and he had helped MacMurrough re-establish his influence in at least the Wexford area, but not over all of Leinster. And from that point, MacMurrough waited in the beautiful town of Ferns in St. Mary's Abbey, which you probably all know, certainly all the Ferns people do, waiting for the fleet to arrive in 1169. So Fitzstephen comes, and he comes with a couple of his nephews, and he comes with Maurice de Prendergast, and he comes with a force of about 600, which is joined by Dermot MacMurrough's force of about 500. So a combined force of only 1,100 men, but a game changer for Ireland. They were coming to stay. Fitzstephen had been offered Wexford Town and 2 cantreds, which would be sort of the equivalent to the area of Forth. So he'd been offered quite a large land grant, and they were coming with the military superpowers of the day, which was cavalry and archers. So it was something the Irish hadn't seen before, and they certainly weren't prepared for, okay? And the first thing they do after they land is they go and attempt to take the town of Wexford. But the town of Wexford at this point had been a Viking town for nearly 300 years. It had been a Viking town since the 880s. So they weren't best pleased with the idea of handing it over to a new force, all right? They resisted the original siege. So this is just showing the siege would have been wooden ramparts, wooden defences, and they resisted for a day or two. And then, as always seems to happen in Irish history, the church got involved. And a bishop negotiated a surrender, is what they tell us in the Chronicles anyway. Now, I should say the Chronicles of Gerald de Barry's are pretty much a work of fiction. There's fact in them, but they're very exaggerated, okay? So I always say to the students who come to us, it's fake news at its best, all right? It's written from one side. So they take the town of Wexford, and then the grant that Dermot MacMurrough had issued to Robert Fitzstephen was renewed, okay? He said, yes, you can have Wexford, but it's a town that doesn't necessarily want them there, and yes, you can have the barony of Forth. So the first night to come. But Robert Fitzstephen knew he'd have to wait at least one more year for the next fleet to come, which is quite a long time to wait in an antagonistic population. So he went 4 kilometres down the Slaney towards Enniscorthy, and he built the first Anglo-Norman castle in Ireland, all right? So as a historian, as an archaeologist, I get excited about dirt and stones and strange things, all right, as do many of us. But if you take a step back, and especially when we're having Brexit at the minute and these negotiations are going on between Ireland and England again, and you think of the resonance of that castle going up and how we still have the northern issue about to rear its head again, it was a very much a seminal moment in the history of both our states, but certainly in the history of Ireland, okay? So this is the castle he built. These are some of the remains we have. This is the ditch he dug, and this is the fake 19th century tower, and that's our site office, okay? So anybody who wants to come and see us digging or see what we're doing, we're open up 40 hours a week all through the summer, and we'd love to see you, okay? So he's holed up there, waiting for the next fleet to come, and that duly arrives in the summer of 1170, an individual called Raymond le Gros, or Raymond the Fat. He was meant to be an absolutely huge man, okay? So he arrives and he goes to Bag and Bun, and we have that expression, the famous expression in Ireland, at Bag and Bun, Ireland was lost or won, okay? What people don't always get is the second half of it. It's won by the Welsh and lost by the Irish. So most of the early knights who came over were more Cambro-Norman than Anglo-Norman, and it always surprises me how we cheer so much when England lose a soccer match, but we're actually quite pro-Wales. So maybe we need to start cheering when Wales lose things as well. Certainly the rugby. So they hold up in Bag and Bun. They put a fortress there. It's described in some chronicles as a flimsy walls of sod and branch, which indicates earthen, okay? And in others as a set of walls with a gate in. But they were certainly there for a period of months. And the Irish laid siege to them. They were opposing them at this point. And legend has it that they drove cattle out to sort of drive the Irish back or skirmish them off the cliffs. And they waited for Strongbow to come. And Strongbow did come to Passage, and he brought another 1,200 men with him to supplement the 3,000 or so that were now with le Gros. So now you're talking serious military forces, 4,000 to 5,000 men, which is a huge amount in the medieval period, okay? They massacred the Irish in Waterford. The story says that the rivers were running red with Irish blood, and Strongbow is married to Aoife at this point. And you can see this is a famous painting, the marriage of Strongbow and Aoife, in the National Gallery, mid-19th century. But you can see Dermot McMurrough in the background is almost serpentine. He's sneery, because this is the point where a Celtic revival is coming and he's become the traitor of Ireland, okay? And you can see the subservient Irish. So it's a great image to indicate the changing of regime or what's happening, all right? Strongbow very quickly came to the throne. So Dermot McMurrough died, unfortunately, in 1171. And immediately the Irish king started to oppose Strongbow ascending to the lordship of Leinster. And that had quite a bit of resonance for our own Robert Fitzstephen at our own site. Because Strongbow was laid siege to in Dublin, and Fitzstephen was also laid siege to at this time in Ferrycarrig. And the reason he was laid siege to is he'd send a lot of his troops to assist Strongbow. So the chronicles again say, and this is where they get fanciful, they say that he had 5 knights and they resisted a force of 3,000 Irish in Ferrycarrig, okay? So the Normans may have been, a new military force, but they weren't of such superior technology that they could confront those odds. What's that, 700 to 1 or 600 to 1? Fitzstephen subsequently surrendered, okay? And he was thrown in chains and he was put in Begarin Island. So does anybody know the Wildfowl Reserve? Yeah, I'm sure some of you know Begarin Island. It's a reclaimed island in the Slavs now. The Slavs are obviously reclaimed in the mid-19th century. But a link here, and Christine can tell you more about it. There's a cross from Begarin Island actually on display at the back of the visitor centre if anybody wants to see it. It's the one on the right, I was told today. So Fitzstephen was put in chains and it sort of ended his career in Wexford. He was later presented to Henry II. He was put in Reginald's Tower in prison again, probably in a show of support from Henry II to the Irish. And he ended his career, well, first with Hugh de Lacy, working around Ireland, then in England, and he ended his career. He died in 1183 in Cork, having been given a kingdom in Cork. So he was only 2 years in Wexford, but such an important legacy in that he did build the first castle in that time, which would have been an earth and timber castle, okay? Strongbow's legacy is obviously bigger, because he started the feudalisation of the county. And this is a good map. I'll just talk through a couple of things on it. You can see on the top, do you see how large these grants are up here? Because it's very easy to give away land that's not yours. All right? So this land was still in control of Irish families in particular, okay? That's why the Northern Land Grants are so large, and you can see Ferns sort of caught in the middle of all this, okay? And this will come to bear as you move forward in the centuries, 13th, 14th century. It's why Ferns was constantly getting burned down, okay? You can see in the south, they're much smaller, and he did quite clever things. He put strong men in control of strategic positions. So you can see Montmorency in the south and what's now Shelburne and Bargy. That was his uncle, all right? So in key strategic positions along the coast or close to the rivers, he generally put family members to exert control, all right? And they started building these castles. So there's two types of Norman earthwork castles. The moat and bailey, which is what most people are familiar with, and the lesser known one is the ringwork. So the moat and baileys, there's about 425 of them, they say, in Ireland. The ringworks, they say there's only about 120, all right? And it happened in our profession. Archaeologists are great at trying to publish papers with their names on them, all right? So in the 70s and 80s, ringworks were newly identified and was a new, bright, shiny thing, and everybody started finding ringworks. I think they were dreaming about them and finding them left, right, and centre. So the vast majority, or a large percentage of the ringworks may not be ringworks at all. Some medievalists would now say 80% of them have been misidentified, okay? Certainly in Wexford, if you counted every possible ringwork, they'd say there's 14. And we've been visiting them all with very royal we. A lady over from Australia has been visiting them all. And the 14 is probably whittled down to a list of about 4 or 5 now. So they're quite an unusual castle type. This is a fairly spectacular example of one. So if you know the Etermine Bridge, go over that from Enniscorthy side and you take a right and you'll reach this site called Doonanore. Any of the students who are here tonight, you're going to see it on Monday, all right? So you'll see it in the flesh. So ringworks typically are thrown up earthwork defences, but without the mountain, okay? So a moat and bailey will have a mound. A ringwork will generally be an enclosing ditch and bank. And they're typically built in areas that are already naturally defensible, like promontories or bends in rivers or cliff faces, okay? They're not sure why they were preferred. They seem to be preferred by the earlier knights who came. My personal opinion on it is it's very hard to get a lot of horses up the top of a big hill, especially if it's got a small top, whereas these would be more suitable for cavalry. Okay, so in the early days, if you're coming with early knights and you need somewhere to keep your horses safe, which are obviously crucial to your military superiority, ringworks would be a preferred defence system. And you can see there's 2 obvious densities of them. Wexford has lots of them, and the Midlands have lots. And they're very rare throughout the rest of the country. And this is our pride and joy. This is the Carrick ringwork, all right? So it's just a rough archaeological plan. That again is your round tower, a large ditch, okay, a bank, and a sheer cliff face, about a 14-metre drop into the River Slaney. So even Giraldus Cambrensis, the chronicler, says it was an already very well naturally defended place that we defended further by artificial means. So it was a very easy location to defend. And you can see our archaeological cuttings, which we'll come back to. But I hope you can make out all those little grey smudges are stones that our students have carefully hand-drawn. So thanks very much for drawing each stone, all right? Which obviously you can see walls here, and you can see the suggestion of a structure here, okay? And we'll come back to what those structures are. But the first and most important thing we were excited about on this site was the fact that it's the first Anglo-Norman castle. And actually I'll go back, because all that really consists of in evidence is a huge ditch, 5-metre deep ditch, all right, and a large bank. And there probably would have been a gatehouse somewhere around here, and then a wooden substructure somewhere in the middle, okay? So we have to try and piece those pieces back together from what's left on the site, and there isn't as much left as we would like. This is what archaeology looks like in the ground. So we get excited about the strangest things, all right? We're an odd bunch. So you see these little holes? They're post holes. They used to hold timber uprights of wooden structures. And we got incredibly excited by those. So when we bring people up and tour the site and we go, do you see that little hole? That's really important. And they go, why? They don't get quite as enamored by them as we do. But over all these little holes was a huge spread of charcoal. So we know the site was burnt out in 1171 when it was laid siege to. We also know that generally in the medieval period, every 30 years or so, you would selectively burn out structures anyway, because it'd be past their active life use. So we don't know if the charcoal spread is from sort of natural living in the space, or whether it's a result of the siege when it was burnt out in 1171. But what we do know is that we sent it off for radiocarbon dates, for charcoal dates, and we got back that it dated somewhere in between 1040 and 1210. Okay, and the probability, a 60% probability, I won't give you too many stats, is that the charcoal dates from 1120 to 1210. And that was over all these post holes. So these post holes are a little bit before then, okay? So they could be the posts of the very first Anglo-Norman house in all of Ireland. And you have to sort of make those leaps. You have to remember what you're looking at, that it's not just a hole in the ground, okay? In that cutting as well, we got a range of hearts, we got a range of larger posts, and we got a range of stake holes. Now, the site has been heavily forested, so sometimes we can't see clear structural forms, but we're starting to see the rough outline of a rectangular timber building, okay? So that's in one area. The second thing we start looking at is the bank and ditch. So this is a section through the interior of the bank, a cutaway of it. In one area, we can see that was the 12th century bank and then it was extended in the 13th. But I guess the crucial thing in terms of talking tonight is we also got a date on that from the bottom here, which came back at about 880 to 980, okay? And I guess there's two things about that. We know the bank was built after that, which we knew anyway, because it's written down that it was built in 1169, okay? But it's tantalizingly early. So we certainly can't say it yet, but we have a date coming back from here that's Viking age. Now, one swallow does not make a summer in archaeology, so we need to get a lot more dates. We need to do a lot more digging. But if you look at Carrickhill, it is extremely hard to imagine that man wasn't there before the Anglo-Normans. It's a perfect spot for natural resources. It's a perfect spot for defence. It's just a nice place to be. And we do know that only 200 metres away from Carrick on the other side of the road, and that's the modern N11 that went in the 1980s, there's a Bronze Age burial dating from about 4,500 years ago. So we know that there was activity on the hill, and indeed we're picking up Bronze Age, late Neolithic, 4,000 or 5,000 year old stone tools in the topsoil from our site as well. So we know there's earlier occupation on the site. What we'd love to in time is find out when, who, why, okay? So that's the ringwork. So the ringwork, timber castle, earth and bank defences, thrown up for the first knights who came to consolidate their position in Ireland until more Anglo-Normans came, until the Support Act came in, all right? But it was replaced by a 12th and 13th settlement in time, both a castle and a town. So we'll move on to them, okay? The different elements, just to talk through them quickly. You have a possible town here, cutting off the promontory, okay? Forget about Roche's Castle, it's quite modern by our standards, it's mid-16th century. You had an Anglo-Norman deer park here, you have a 14th century church down here, and then you have two streams, each of which is thought to have, or certainly one of which is recorded as having medieval mills, okay? And then you had, of course, where the name comes from, Ferry on the Rock, the Ferry of Carrick. You had a ferry service here from the medieval period right up until 1795. So an awful lot of different elements going on, okay? The first thing I'd like to talk about is the castle. And we know the castle is up by 1231. We don't know when it goes up. We're normally not lucky enough in archaeology. Normally we're digging the material culture of people like everyone in this room. And I'm not offending anyone in that. They're just normal people with their pots and their pans and whatever they have. It's very rare that we have historical records in archaeology of it's such and such a person and such and such a person. And it's made us a bit greedy on the Carrick site because we're told the castle was up by 1231 and we go, well, I want to know if it was up by 1225 or 1226. And archaeology can't always do that. If we were to give a best guess, the Marshalls were building castles, certainly in Carlow went up 1210 to 1215. And William Marshall II got service to the Crown excused in the 1220s. So he could consolidate and finish off his castles in Ireland. So Ferns would have been going up that time, combination of the two Marshalls, and probably Carrick was as well, okay? This is a much more complete Marshall castle, okay? I don't even know why I put this slide in, because you can just look out the window. It doesn't make a huge amount of sense in this building, but it's left over anyway. So Carrick is one of about three probable Marshall castles at this time, and there's 6 13th century early castles in Wexford. So it's one of only a half dozen, okay? So you're talking Wexford, Carrick, Ferns, Old Ross, which obviously is older than New Ross, okay? Great Island and Enniscorthy by the de Prendergast. So it's even very special in that right. I know we can't rival the beauty of this, but we're still proud of our own few stones. And when I say few stones, I mean few stones, because that's what ours looks like. So, okay, it's not quite as pretty. I really shouldn't have put ferns in. So this is obviously corner of a structure, all right? And you can see when you bring the plan in together, so you can see what we call cutting one up here, or area one that we're excavating. We have the remains starting to come together of a 2-room structure here. And then in cutting 3 over here, we have the remains of a smaller structure here. And this is one of the problems we have, as I said, with archaeology. We get a bit greedy. We're trying to figure out, there's a castle recorded on the site by 1231, and there's also a hall and a chapel recorded on the site in 1324. So there's at least 3 stone buildings recorded at Carrick, and we only have 2 of them, all right? So we're trying to figure out what's going on. Obviously, well, not obviously, our best guess is that some people are referring to a building as a castle and some people are referring to it as a hall, and they're actually probably one and the same. Or the 13th century castle is modified into a 14th century hall, if that sort of makes sense. But we don't have a huge amount left of them. And we know by 1324 that already Carrick is being recorded as quite ruinous and in a bad state. And it's recorded again in 1420 as ruined and burnt down, but still there. And those sort of records continue. So Carrick as a settlement probably only at its heyday only lasted about 150 years. And we'll talk more about that as well, okay? This slide gives well, it's actually not a better picture, but it gives another indication of the walls. But one thing we have done, which will, as we move through the talk, will make more sense, is we've looked at the geology of all the stone to compare it to buildings in the vicinity, the state houses, the round tower, etc., to try and figure out where the castle went. Okay, so we'll talk about the destruction of it very shortly. And then we have the towns. So the Marshalls especially, William Marshall ascended into the lordship in 1189, William Marshall the senior, and he was succeeded by his son in 1219. And there were European knights operating at a European scale with a European outlook. So they brought this huge amount of infrastructure to Ireland that we didn't have before, and they thought differently. So for argument's sake, a great example of this is Wexford had been established for 300 or 400 years at that point. And they said, you know what, the Slaney isn't a big enough river. We're going to abandon Wexford and we're going to build New Ross. And I'm going to put my capital up in Kilkenny. So they had the ambition and they had the means and they had the connections to do things at a hitherto absolutely unseen scale. All right. So in this period, they start putting up huge monastic houses like Tintern and Dunbrody. They start putting up an awful lot of castles, like we talked about, and they start building towns. So if you remember before the Anglo-Normans came, the Vikings, there's only 5 Viking towns in the whole of Ireland. Okay. The Marshalls themselves built 9 in Wexford, and there were 12 put in this period. So places that we all know, but a lot of them have gone out of use. So obviously Wexford survives, Fern survives, Glascarrig. No offence if anyone's from Glascarrig, but I certainly wouldn't call it a town anymore, all right? It's a lovely spot, but it's far from a town. Timon, okay, it's still a village. Old Ross is gone completely, created by New Ross. The island's gone, Banno's gone, Feathered's gone. Clonmine's now a village, and our own Carrick. So the vast majority, I should not call Clonmines a village. The vast majority aren't with us anymore, but it was a very ambitious statement of intent about what they were going to do in our country. A town, in case anyone was wondering what a town is by medieval standards, it's somewhere with burgage plots, which is a plot of land given out, that you had to pay a tax for the privileges of living in a town, for the defence, for the specialist trades, etc. It's generally somewhere on a major route, somewhere that has a market, and somewhere, according to John Bradley, that has at least 3 of walls, a castle, a cathedral, a bridge, a hospital, administrative buildings and specialist technologies. So there's very specific criteria on what makes a town, okay? But our own Carrick was certainly one of them. And this is where it is. So this is our castle. This is the beautiful 1980s road to Rosslare Airport. We're not too keen on it, all right? And this is where we found evidence of the town, okay? You can see it sort of slightly differently shown on the first edition map. We did a bit of geophysics in the town, and we've certainly turned up archaeology. So geophysics is effectively an X-ray of the ground, and we can see a curving feature here. Incidentally, see those nice little rings? They would be consistent with ring barrows, which are Bronze Age burial places. And the Bronze Age burial was actually found under the house just here. So whether there's also prehistoric activity on the site, we don't know, all right? There was also a bit of archaeological testing done in here in 2006 ahead of a private development for a house, and they certainly found medieval features, and all the pottery was in a 150 to 200 year bracket, which is perfect for us because that's how long we think Carrick last, all right? So this is where we think the town was. And then it goes to reading the landscape and sort of understanding the size of other towns and trying to reconstruct where it might have been. So you can see, I know we've had bad builders in Ireland in the last 15 or 20 years, but taking a right angle turn in a road like that for no reason doesn't really make much sense, okay? And if you project that across, you're cutting off a perfect promontory. Does that make sense? If you project that turn, you see on the first edition map, the 19th century map, that I'm projecting across also was perfectly mapped in field boundaries, and that encloses an area of 18 acres, all right? Incidentally, Clonmines was 20, Bannow was 19 or 20, Feathered was 19 or 20, so it would be consistent in size as well to other medieval towns in Wexford. And then you go back a bit further to the 17th century, and you get, I should flip it over because it's the other orientation, so if you just flip that in your mind, okay, you get this lovely promontory here again. This is where Carrickcastle or Ringwork was, and it's a specific landholding unit that existed in the 1650s called Ballin's Land, okay, and you can see it's 17 acres. So this specific unit of land has existed since at least the 1650s, this 17-acre bit of land. So our best guess is that's where the town was, okay? In terms of what we know about it, we don't know much more. We know there's medieval features in one bit. We're guessing it's 18 acres. Archaeologically, we know nothing else, except obviously what the historical sources tell us. So there's inquisitions every time somebody dies on the value of their estates. And in 1307, judging by the taxes that were returned for the town, it had about 110, 111 houses, okay? If you put 5 or 6 people into a house in medieval times, that's coming up on 500 to 700 people. Wexford had about 330 houses, so it's not an insignificant settlement by any stretch of the imagination, okay? But we know very little about it, okay? We still need to do more research on it. Other elements of the town that we had, it had a ferry. So this is a beautiful painting by Sandby in the late 18th century. There's some things that are wrong because you're looking out to the Irish Sea and Mount Leinster is in front of you, so it should be behind you. And this cliff face is definitely smaller than this cliff face, okay? But the ferry had been there for quite a few hundred years, and indeed it was used up until 1795 when the bridge went in, okay? And we have records to a ferry right the way through, 1307, 1324, a few of them in the 16th century, and it was operated by the Roaches from the 14th century right the way through to the 17th century. So this tower house, so some people call Ferry Carrickcastle, is Roaches Castle, okay? And the first reference I can find to it is 1581, but you can see there's gun loops on it, and when you look at the windows on it, so it's definitely a much later period, and we know that typologically anyway, that's an awful lot later. We know the town had mills, and we have almost no evidence of them, but the mills again are recorded in the early 14th century, right the way through to the 16th. Then they sort of disappear from the records, as best I can find, but there is records of 18th century milling on the Carrick River as well. So if you're thinking of large scale settlements, you have your own ferry service. It's the only crossing over the river before Enniscorthy. So it's the trade route for all the goods coming from Wexford going north up through the county before Enniscorthy. You have your mills, you have a significant town, and you have a stone castle. Carrick is not an insignificant settlement. It's just that you can't see it unless you look a bit deeper today, if that makes some sort of sense. Am I making any sort of sense? Yeah? Then we have our medieval church, okay? So the medieval church is quite a bit south of the town. As you can see, it's down here. And the significance of that we'll come back to. And the first record I can see for this is 1385. And it's recorded again in 1635 in good repair. But there's a guy called Lewis who wrote a book all through Ireland in 1837, and he says only a few stones remained. So it's definitely gone by the 19th century, and that's the state that it still remains in now. It's a beautiful little spot. It's got a D-shaped enclosure around it, and it's definitely worth a visit if anyone wants to go up. And the last jewel in the crown, but one of my favourites of Carrick, is the Deer Park. So you can see again there's sort of a much larger promontory coming up this way. Okay, so this is our little Carrick promontory, which is here. And you can see a larger promontory of land as you go over to Wexford, nearly the whole way into Wexford. The first reference of a deer park at Carrick dates to about 1234. Back, there's only 45 deer parks known from the whole of Ireland, and they're only built on high status sites, okay? When they say deer park, it can be a bit misleading because sometimes they'd hold cattle, or they'd coppice woods out of them, or they'd use them for other purposes, for foraging. But the higher status, the lordly ones, they introduced fallow deer. So fallow aren't a native Irish species, the red is, fallow aren't. So the lords could go out in their leisure when they had their mates over and they could hunt a few fallow and bring it back to their table and show off their prestige. Carrick is the first recorded deer park in the whole of Ireland, all right? It's also, in terms of the excavations, we've found fallow deer bone. So it's also some of the earliest fallow bones from an archaeological excavation as well. So it seems this deer park went in quite early. It was certainly in by 1231 to 34 when it's first recorded. And in 1225, we know the king gave William Marshall a gift of 20 fallow does to send to his deer parks in Ireland. So whether they came to Carrick or not, we don't know. But if it's a good story and it sells students, we will tell them that they did, all right? In later inquisitions, there's no mention of the deer park. It's already gone by the early 14th century. But what you do have is you have constant mentions of parcels of land that were exactly the same size as the Carrick Deer Park, which is about 300 acres, okay? Again, to put that in perspective, the largest deer park in Ireland is about 500. Most of them are about 80 to 150 acres, so 300 is a good sized deer park. I know I'm sort of rabbiting on about deer parks and people are going, so what? But when you bring the whole message together, you have a settlement that only lasted 150 years. You have a very high status item like a deer park. You have your mills, you have your ferry, you have your town, you have your castle. And all of them seem to only last that 150 years. So what it seems to me is that the marshals came over with this intent of making Carrick some grand settlement, and historical circumstances took over, okay? Another neat, and we can't do an archaeological talk without even one artifact. So this is just a distribution of different potteries. We'll talk about it in a second. But you see what looks like a little claw? It's actually, as I said, we do get excited about strange things. Little holes in the ground with little pottery claws. This is actually their showing of a fallow antler, okay? And it comes from quite an unusual material culture item called an aqua manile. So aqua from water and manile from hands. And it's a quite posh, all right? It'd be a Miss Bouquet sort of item. Water jug that you only use at the Eucharist or you use to wash your hands on high status meals. Usually in metal, they're usually in the shape of an animal or animals and people, but they're only from very high status sites. So it's definitely our favorite little artifact to date from the excavation. In terms of it being another bit of ceramic, the ceramic tells us that they're still very much looking towards the old country. An awful lot of English potteries and quite a lot of French, but they're also making an awful lot of their own, okay? The other thing we have in Carrick, which is tantalising, I shouldn't even say this because we don't really have enough evidence to put it out there, but we're starting to get tantalising evidence of pottery manufacture on site, and there's no confirmed kiln yet for the whole of Wexford. Now, we don't have one yet either, but we're getting an awful lot of glaze on stones and on various different items as if pottery was being made on site. We just need to find the kiln. So again, a very much, at least in the 13th century, a quite high status site. But what happens to it? And it sort of mirrors the experience of all of Wexford, and to a lesser extent the whole of the country. William Marshall, you probably all know the story. He dies in 1231. He has no male heir. There was meant to be a curse put on him by none other than the Bishop of Ferns, actually. All right. So all the male heirs of the Marshall family die out in the space of 10 or 15 year period, and Leinster has to be divided amongst 4 women, or as 4 of William Marshall the first daughters. 5 shares. 5 shires: Carlow, Kildare, Wexford, Kilkenny, and a new portion made out of Laois and Offaly, which is called Doonamace, okay? If you can imagine what that does for your political integrity, you have a cohesive lordship that can be administered by one person, and suddenly it's all divided out and parcelled off, and it's all weakened because it's portioned out in that manner. The way they portioned it made it even worse. The daughters all had to get an entirely equal share. We've been fighting over inheritance since day dot. So you would have somebody having Carlow, but they'd give you a little bit of Wexford to make it the same as somebody who had Kildare with a little bit of Kilkenny. So it was all partitioned up and parcelled off to try and give them as close an inheritance as they could. And just a few stats, I never try and put too much text in a presentation, but you can see in 1247, so this is when this partition happened, Wexford's worth £42. This is right down the south of the county. 50 years later, it's worth 32. So it's going down, but it's not too bad. Carrick's hit a bit worse. It goes down from 24 to 11. And this is when Carrick is first recorded as ruinous in 1324, okay? And all the towns are starting to get dilapidated and in decline, but Ferns is by far the worst. So Ferns, 1247 is worth £42, it's a decent town, and by 1325 it's worth nothing. And that comes back to, next slide, I guess, actually, no, go back one. That comes back to how the Irish were interacting to the weakened political structure. So Ferns is obviously further north, closer to those Irish areas I pointed out when I was talking about Strongbow, and they were coming down and burning and raiding the town, and obviously subsequently took it back over for a period of nearly 150 or 200 years, but I'm sure there's no Ferns person in the room who doesn't know that. The Anglo-Normans' response was probably bigger than most people think. So there's a couple of smaller rivers, the Carrick and the Pill, and they actually made those deeper. They physically dug them out and started building castles across the centre of Wexford County. So if you picture a line from New Ross up to about Cahors, give or take, they made a physical boundary and said, we will hold south of this line and we'll give the rest back to the Irish. Okay? So Wexford ended up being divided into 3 zones. It had an Irish north, a hybrid middle, and an Anglo-Norman stronghold on Forth and Bargy in the south, all right? And that's part of the reason why Forth and Bargy have always been a bit of a world apart. So you know the way Yola comes from that area of the county? From that point, it's an enclave. It's almost like an island within the county, and certainly an island within the island of Ireland. And it's the Wexford Pale. So when we talk about the Pale, most people think of Dublin and its hinterland. There were 2 Pales in Ireland to this point, the Wexford Pale and the Dublin Pale. So the integrity of the lordship had been undermined by its division, but also they were hit by an awful lot of bad luck. So in terms of historical events that happened at this time, you have the Bruce invasion in the 14th century. That's 1315. You have the Black Death come in 1348 into Drogheda. In certain locations, that's depopulating towns by 50-60%. So if your town is already in decline and you have a 60% chance of catching the Black Death, you're quite likely to leave, okay, and abandon urban centres. You have a resurgent Gaelic Irish leadership under Art McMurrough, okay, who's an astute political leader and a good military tactician. So the Irish are on the way up, and the Anglo-Normans are right on the way down, okay? The product of that for places like Ferns was burnt in 1331, was burnt in 1358, and by 1360, it comes back to the McMurroghs and it stays with the McMurroghs for about 150, 200 years. So the north of the county's back being Irish, the south of the county is still very much Anglo-Norman, and Carrick is at the northern limits of how far the Irish are coming down, okay? But all those reasons contribute to its decline. The most obvious reason that it just didn't probably take is it's too close to Wexford, all right? And if you go back a slide, you can see how many monuments and how much is in Wexford. And look at poor little Carrick, it's only got 3 or 4 dots. These are monuments, all right? So it was unlikely to ever outcompete the town of Wexford. It was probably doomed from the get-go, had a 150-year heyday, and then as soon as things got tough, it just died a death, all right? The only other thing you'll notice is this is Carrick Church that I showed in the 14th century. It could be at this time that the town up here was abandoned and the settlement focus shifted a little bit to this crossroads, which became more of a village. And you will see there's a 16th century tower house up there as well. So the town was abandoned, dies a death, and almost starts to pass out of human memory, okay? Which is something we're trying to resolve. But there were still ruins there, and as late as 1587, we have a record to the ruined castle of Carrick still standing. And as you can see from the few stones I showed you, there's virtually nothing now. And why is that? Where did the rest of it go? Well, this is a late 18th century photo with Roche's Castle, or a photo, it's certainly not a late photo, painting. And this is where our castle would be, okay? So there's no sign of it, but in terms of spot the difference in 50 years, it's fairly obvious the bridge has gone in 1795, okay? The O'Donovan letters, which are a great resource if anyone's ever doing any sort of research, that refers to the Bridge of Wexford, which was also built in 1795 by the same architect, a Mr. Cox, taking stone from the Carrick site. So effectively using the castle as a quarry. And it's intuitive to believe if they were bringing it all the way to Wexford by boat 4 kilometres down the road, they were bringing it to Ferry Carrick Bridge as well, okay? A kilometre or 2 down the road, we have Belmont House. Well, we don't because it's gone. We had Belmont House up until a generation or 2 ago. These are the stable yards, ancillary buildings, other ruins associated with Belmont. This was built 1800, and a variety of sources again say that stone was taken from both the mills of Carrick, the medieval mills of Carrick, and from the castle to contribute to the construction of Belmont House. And then perhaps the final death nail in the coffin. This is an 1840s map, the first edition Ordnance Survey. I'm sure some people are familiar with it. That's your original 1850s ditch and castle. And you see that little subtle dotted rectangle in the middle. That's their way of indicating to us that there's ruins on the site. It's not good enough to say it's a castle. It's not good enough to say site of castle, which is what they often, well, you can see site of castle for the round part, but they're not saying there's a structure here, they're saying there's something ruinous. This is 1840, okay? And then in 1866, a gentleman called O'Hanrahan writes a novel called Eve, which is sort of like a 19th century Mills and Boon novel, that's what I compare it to, about the exploits of Robert Fitzstephen and his romantic, I'm trying to think of a polite way of putting it, conquest. His romantic conquest is a good way of putting it. And he visits this site and he says not a trace of Ferry Carrig remains. Now whether that's his not a trace, because we have tourists coming up to the site now and go, sure, there's nothing left here because there's only a few stones, and we're going, no, there's loads, all right? So whether it's his not a trace or whether it was actually nothing there, we can't say for sure. But what we can say, in the 26-year period between the map and his book, they put up this tower in 1857, all right? And we've looked at the geology of the tower, we've looked at the geology of Belmont, and we can't look at the geology of the bridge because the stone foundations are underwater, and they all match the geology of the ruins. Now, the only thing I will say, I'm going to put a large caveat on that, they're all built from local stone, so it doesn't tell you a whole lot, okay? But they do certainly match. And then the next seed or seminal change comes in the 1980s. So that's the old Oak Tavern, or the area of it, on the old bridge, as I'm sure some people remember it. And you see a beautiful cliff face, and what would have been a gorgeous medieval town just waiting for archaeologists to come and dig it. And unfortunately, they decided to put a highway through it, okay? And there was no archaeological mitigation for that at the time, but it's obviously different times. 1980s, things were different. We have heard oral histories where there was human remains countered by the digger drivers. We haven't been able to substantiate them, and even if we do, we don't know if they're from the medieval castle and town, or if they're from the Bronze Age cemetery at the other side, or a combination of both, all right? In the 1980s, when this road was going in, there was also an excavation started at the site by an archaeologist called, well, first Isabel Bennett with the Blue Box in 84, and then an archaeologist called Claire Cotter in 85, 86. So she dug out all the ditch and she did a bit in the inside, okay? And this was all done in advance of the road and in advance of the Irish National Heritage Park opening. So you can see the site under excavation here, the ditch is coming out and the replicas are starting to go up and be constructed. And of course the Heritage Park now, if anybody hasn't been there, go there. It's probably the best day out in Wexford. But it's a beautiful spot to spend a day or spend multiple days. So there were all these changes in the 1980s to the landscape around the site. By far the biggest one being the road. The site started to be excavated and then the park went in. And then we came here in 2018. So we've been doing a few field schools around Ireland. I'm from Wexford, but I'm living in Birr. So we're based in Wexford and Birr, but by far our marquee project now is Ferry Carrig. It's where we spend 80 or 90% of our time, okay? And this is what the site looked like when we started. So this is a before picture, and this is after Chris and Tony and Tucker and all the ground staff at the park when they cleared half the site. So as soon as it was cleared, you could literally see nothing. You could already start to make out the 1980s holes, okay? Does that make sense? So this would be our cutting. This is where the Great Hall is located, and the chapel we found roughly in here, or what we think is the chapel, okay? The reason, incidentally, we've found no archaeological evidence it's a chapel, but it's on a direct east-west orientation, where everything else is on a different orientation. It makes no sense. And we know there was a chapel recorded on the site, so we're tentatively interpreting the second building as a chapel, okay? All the digging is done by fantastic people who come from all over the world, lovely students, and they're here for about 3 or 4 months in the summer and 1 month in January and February. I guess the reason why it's relevant, the reason why I'm saying it to you, is if any of you come to Ferry Carrig, you'll see someone wearing those orange vests, and that means they're on duty as tour guides, and they'll spend as long as you want. If you want 5 minutes, they'll talk to you for 5 minutes. If you want to be bored for the whole day, they'll tour you around the whole day as well. They'll show you the artifacts, they'll explain the archaeological features. The whole point of this project, the whole reason that we were asked to come on board by the park was to bring the site back into community and public consciousness. And that's part of why I'm here talking tonight, and to make it accessible to the local community. So anybody could come to Carrick and anybody could understand Carrick. So if you're around and you're brave enough to walk up the hill, we'd be delighted to see you. And what you will see when you come, this is the map I showed you earlier. So we're expanding cutting 4 is what we call it. And the reason we're hoping to do that is get a return on this chapel building. This would be the eastern side of the chapel, where the altar would be, the window would be. So if we are to get any pretty stuff off the site, which is unlikely because they tend to take that stuff away, we're most likely to get it here. All our 12th century archaeology, 1169-ish archaeology was in here. So we're going down deeper in this cutting to try and get more of it. And we're very excited to be opening up a new cutting 5. All right. Someone suggested calling cutting 24 just to throw people, but we're going to go with cutting 5. All right, and try and trace the outline of this structure. So we have one stone structure here and another stone structure here, but we'll talk you through that if anyone wants to come up to the site. In addition to the digging, we've done a whole host of surveys of various different things. So we've done fancy 3D scanning. It's not really relevant in terms of tonight, except to say we've also done it at Ferns Castle in the last few weeks. And that can be used for digital representations and for conservation and management of the site. We've done geophysics, we've surveyed Roche's Castle, we've assessed all the geology. But the reason we were sort of rushing doing all this last year and trying to get an awful lot done in a year was we were trying to put something together, a package together for the 850th anniversary of the site, together with the park. Because in an ideal world, we would have had 3 or 4 years to do it, but celebrating the 853rd birthday of Carrick doesn't have quite the same ring to it, all right? So this is what we came up with all those surveys and the bits of digging that the students have done so far. We have this calendar of events, so this is tonight. But if anybody wants to come in here, Ian Doyle speaking Tintern in a couple of weeks, we'd be delighted to see you. And then we round out a lecture series on July 18th back in Wexford Library with Dr. Michael Potterton. And all this is on I think we left flyers in everyone's desk as well, okay? Or everyone's chair, we should say. We have an open day on July 26th, which is specifically, because I feel sorry, I saw a couple of young kids here and the poor creators having to listen to this. The 26th day you guys will love. It's all about kids. There'll be a kids archaeology camp, there'll be storytelling, there'll be people in traditional garb. It's specifically for families, but there'll be stuff for adults there as well on the 26th. And then we're ending our calendar of events in October with our first book launch on Carrick, describing at length everything I've said. So if you've enjoyed it, you'll enjoy reading the book. If you haven't enjoyed the talk, you can get it for insomnia, but just buy a copy. I don't care why you buy it, just buy one. And that's the details of the conference. So all this is up online, guys, if anybody wants to see what we're doing, both in terms of the site or the celebrations we have or why we're having them or when our next talks are. And the conference will have 21 speakers from all over Ireland and internationally, and we're hosting it in the park. So again, it'll be quite different because we'll have a traditional conference day 1 of PowerPoint, death by PowerPoint, as Alan says. And on day 2, we'll have much more practical, hands-on experiential sessions, which complements the strengths of the park, that you're actually getting out, you're doing and learning with your hands instead of just listening to someone rabbit on, okay? So I think that's my hour. So if anybody's any questions, it'll be best to answer them. If not, I'd love to see somebody up at the site. So if there's any questions, great. If not, that's great too. I'm done. It's a different period. During the Tudor period, you said, is it? Yeah, it would be a different period. Who's this? You said your daughter? Or, yeah. No, it is a different period, so I'm not sure if Carrick would fit in seamlessly, but I'd be happy to, if she wants to call up to the site for a cup of tea, and I'll talk it through with her if that's of any use. We're there 40 hours a week, as I said, Monday to Friday, so I'm not sure if Carrick per se would fit in, but I'd be happy to chat other things through with her.
So there was a Pale in Wexford, and as a Wexford man that was born and raised in the Pale, I left the Pale tonight to come up here to Ferns. I'll definitely be coming back again. Dennis was great. There's been a great reaction inside, a lovely crowd, and we're going to turn the camera off now and have a look around Ferns Castle, which is absolutely amazing. Thanks very much.